Cindy Frenkel's Remembrance, Galway Kennel, and the Blue Button Down appeared in the Southampton Review. Her essay from the anthology To Light a Fire, Hearing Voices, Acting Crazy, is about being a writer in residence with Inside Out Literary Arts Project, which brings working poets into Detroit public schools. Her most expansive piece about teaching was recently published overseas in Writing and Education, entitled 15 Lessons from 9 Years of Teaching. Frenkel's poetry has appeared in numerous places, including Mom Egg Review, The MacGuffin, The Alembic, Poetica, Peacock Journal, and Renaissance City. Thanks for sharing your precious time with me and Pink Panther Magazine today. So many are calling The Plague of the Tenderhearted a motivational work because it inspires readers that there is joy in life beyond our sorrows. And I'm pretty excited to talk to you today about this new collection and your literary lifestyle and all of our common interests in the creative writing world and just being busy women. So without further ado, let's get started with the first question. Your background in poetry is impressive. For our viewers who aren't familiar with your poetry roots, why don't you tell us a little bit about your formal education and your journey as a poet?
Okay, first of all, I want to thank you so much for having me on. I'm excited and nervous, naturally. Well, my journey is very circuitous and long because this book has taken me many years to get published. And I'm really grateful that I had a lot of rejection before because every rejection I had helped me hone it. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't ready. And I hope it is now. I think it is. So I'm trying to think where to start. I think I'll start with my education work background. So I went to a little college in Vermont called Bennington for 2 years, and I majored in English and theater. And I also loved ceramics, so a lot of art, visual art. And then I went to U of M. And when I was at Bennington, I studied with one of my all-time favorite teachers, a man named Harry Matthews, who was the first American, it might have been the only American, to be a member of the French writing group Oulipo, with a lot of experimental writing. And some people might know of the novelist George Perec, who wrote an entire novel without using the letter E, which is very typical of the kind of people Harry hung out with. And Harry was a wonderful force in my life because I really doubted my abilities and he did not. And I think it's really important when you have someone who's teaching you, who believes in you. And I remember writing something in his class and he laughed so hard he was crying. We had to choose 4 words that were odd and use them in different orders. And the words I chose were dyspepsia, nuance, opera, and snorkel. And I didn't understand the word nuance well, so I wanted to use it. And it was a pretty zany story, as you might imagine. Yes. Then I transferred to U of M, where I did some theater and a lot of writing. And I graduated from U of M, and then I went to New York. I followed my then boyfriend, who was the man I was going to marry. And he was in theater. And my very first job in New York was at an ice cream parlor. It was phenomenal ice cream on the Upper West Side. They said, you can eat as much as you want. You'll get tired of it. You won't want to eat. You won't want to keep eating, but that did not happen to me.
It didn't happen to me either.
It was a problem. I never got tired of it. But one thing I learned there, which was really remarkable, was that my boss, who was very kind, was in a mass wedding at Madison Square Garden. She was a Moonie. So she did not know her husband, and she got married in this group ceremony. Group is an understatement, a very large ceremony. And it was my first introduction to learning the power of thinking as an individual. And because I couldn't believe she was working so hard and giving all her money to Reverend Moon. Then I went to Glamour magazine and I was writing letters from the editor. So if somebody wrote in and said, I want to break up with my boyfriend and I've been with him 4 years, how do I go about it without hurting his feelings? I don't think that's really possible, first of all.
Right?
But I would give them gentle tips on how to do so. Or if they wanted to travel to Europe for 10 days and they only had one carry-on luggage, what's the best way to pack? And I would tell them how to mix and match their outfits, whatever. Or they were interested in
Yes.
going into modeling, and I would have to advise them, it is not a glamorous lifestyle. It's really hard and you're completely objectified. You might want to think twice. So it
Oh my
was.
God, I'm thinking about how many times was I sitting in a doctor's office or somewhere reading the magazine and reading your stuff. I love it.
Well, I was actually writing the readers directly. I don't know if I can't even remember if my letters get in, but I worked for a woman who was anorexic and then she was bulimic and she wasn't in recovery. And when I was working for her, the Xerox machine broke, and it would break regularly. And I would tell her and she would scream at me, and I would come home 3 out of 5 nights a week in tears. And my parents said, you got to suck it up. The real world's tough. You've been pretty sheltered. And then I met a cousin who was a distant cousin who was an editor at Scholastic. And she said to me, no, you should pretty much like what you do. I mean, you might not love it every day, but you should like the overall experience of your job. And so she planted a seed. And then I came to a file one day, and I'm using this in my writing, but it was just emblematic of a signal for me to leave Glamour. The file literally said, what to do with your eyeshadow when it creases in the lids of your eyes. And I said, that's it. This job is not for me. And I left.
Blended.
Literally. And then Harry and I were talking, and he said, if you could do anything you want to do, what would you do? What would be your dream job? And I said, to do anything at the New Yorker. And then Sue Shapiro, a friend of mine from U of M, was working there, and Harry connected me with a woman in fiction, and both of them let me know about job openings, and I applied. And I don't think I got the job the first time, but they told me to try again. And the woman I worked for, who hired me as an underling, I was a typist. I was in, it was called Walden Pond. That's what we called it. It was the typing pool. And then you went around to different departments and filled in. So I worked in fiction and in the library. I wound up moving to the library. I was at their library for over 2 years. But Harriet Walden was the woman who hired me. And I thank her in this book, even though she's no longer alive. One of my biggest regrets was not flying back to New York for her 90th birthday party. I was kind of a mess then because I was still dealing with a lot of the grief that this book covers. But she was truly the embodiment of kindness. She was the nicest person I've ever worked for. And I had heard Galway Kinnell read when I was a student in Ann Arbor, and I was just floored. I absolutely was smitten with his work and his presence. And he had just started the graduate program at NYU, and he was looking for students. And I just wanted to take a workshop with him. So I called up NYU and arranged to have an interview. And I think I spoke to him. Yeah, and he told me to bring samples of my work. And I wrote about this in that piece, Galway Kinnell and the Blue Button Down. So I went to his office and we sat and we talked. And one of the things I mentioned in the piece is he said to me, so who do you read? And I said, I can't remember the exact answer, but something to the effect of, I read Marianne Moore and Elizabeth Bishop and Galway Kinnell. And we both started laughing. And he read my work, and this is sort of embarrassing, but he was looking for students, and he said, you can join the program. Well, I hadn't applied. I was like, excuse me? This is supposed to be really hard, right? And I was so floored. And now I look back, and it was sort of like the Groucho Marx line, any club that wants to have me as a member, this isn't. So I said, can I think about it? I just want to study with you. And he said, absolutely. So I enrolled in his workshop, and he was incredible, just so kind. And the people there were enormously talented. They all worked full-time in the day, and we went to graduate school at night. I was in my element. And then my dad kept asking me to, as long as I was going to go to graduate school, I matriculated. Carolyn Forche was teaching, E.L. Doctorow. I thought, yeah, I better take more classes here. So I decided to enroll. And then Galway won the Pulitzer while I was there. So that piece is about Galway winning the Pulitzer and my celebrating with him and my relationship with him. That's part of it. It's also about my complicated relationship with my father. So my father, once he found out that I was going to go to graduate school full time, asked me to apply to Columbia. Well, Columbia was known to be really cutthroat. I'm not a competitive person. You know that. I compete with myself. I run away from that kind of energy.
Right.
And I didn't want to go. And he kept saying it. And my parents they loved me dearly, and they were also very controlling, which is a form of fear. And I didn't know that growing up. So he didn't suggest it once or twice. He suggested it, probably 20 or 30 or 40 times. And finally, I applied. So when I got into Columbia, a school I didn't want to be at, I felt really weird. And I had to tell Harriet Walden, Mrs. Walden is what we called her, that wonderful boss, who, by the way, was E.B. White's original secretary.
Wow.
And her husband was a playwright, William Walden. And I remember her saying once that Bill almost got hurt last night because he had opened his file cabinets. There were 2 drawers, and both of them were open, and it almost tipped over on him. And she could just picture the headlines, "Playwright killed by his own plays." And yeah, she was wonderful. And so I had to tell her I got accepted at Columbia, which was in the daytime. I don't think I'd been at the magazine 6 months. And I felt like an idiot because I didn't want to go to Columbia. And I'd asked even Howard Moss, who was the poetry editor of the New Yorker, if I should go to Columbia, and he told me no. But my main drive was to please my dad. You know, I wanted to please him. And I didn't know then, I didn't have the wisdom of age that you cannot please someone else. It doesn't work. You can do whatever you want to try to please them, but if they're not happy with who they are, you can't please them. So I wound up at Columbia, but when I told Harriet, Mrs. Walden, I went to her office. She had a big poster of Eleanor Roosevelt on the wall, and I was really nervous. And I explained about my dad wanted me to go to Columbia, and she had her
Oh yes, the spectacles.
glasses down like this. She was looking at me like this, and I said, and I applied to Columbia, and she went, "So, did you get in?" It was just so sweet. You know, a normal boss would have said, "Excuse me, you haven't been here a year? What are you talking about?" She arranged it for me to work part-time while I was in graduate school and slide back into full-time after.
Wow.
And the New Yorker hours were amazing. They were so civil. They were 10 to 6. I'm not a morning person. So that was just wonderful for me. So then I worked in her office for about just under 3 years. And then I moved to the library there. And the library was a wonderful place because you read the magazine, and there were 3 of us, and it got divided in thirds. And then we summarized it and categorized it so that it would be appropriately archived. And we also got to see the New Yorker cartoons before they got bought.
Love it.
Because the artists would submit cartoons. I think it was on a Tuesday, I can't remember, to an editor named Lee Lorenz, and Lee would pick out the ones he thought were good. Then he'd send them down to the library because the New Yorker was so anal. God forbid they should have a cartoon about women, curly hair, and writers, right? So you can't have 2 like that. One might be talking to her shrink lying on the couch, and another might be fishing, but the overlap might not be okay to do, you know? So it was our job in the library to make sure that nothing similar had run before. So that was really fun to get to know some of the cartoonists and to see the cartoons before they got bought. And of course, the atmosphere was incredible because the people were just extraordinary. I actually have, only on Zoom, Jenifer, I showed my students, you can't see it here, but there, in the corner up here is a name tag from the New Yorker. Had parties every Christmas at the Pierre Hotel, and you couldn't bring your significant other, it was only employees. And Ed Koren, who wouldn't remember me now, was a very famous cartoonist, and he wore, his name tag was one of his characters that he drew. And I said, "Ed, I love your name tag." And he just took it off and gave it to me, and he wrote on the back a note. It was very sweet. And my friend Karen framed it beautifully, and it's
I love it.
one of my little treasures from there. So anyhow, I was at the New Yorker, and then the New Yorker was bought Condé Nast owned it, and William Shawn had been the editor, and then Bob Gottlieb came in, and Bob Gottlieb had headed Random House. And I suggested a column on shopping, and I gave it to Bob Gottlieb. I was sick when he arrived, which I think was in my favor, but I didn't know it at the time because everybody was meeting him at once and I wasn't there. So I sent a manuscript to him. It was long. It was maybe somewhere between 40 and 70 pages. It was on shoe shopping in New York. It had all these comments, acerbic comments and kind comments, and just, it had a lot of personality. It wasn't just about shoes. And I told him I thought that a revival of this, a woman had written a column on fashion, and I thought a revival of this could be interesting. And I introduced myself to him and I said, rather than telling you what I could do, I thought it would be better to show you, because I wanted him to see that, you know, hopefully he would think I could write, which he did. And he called me into his office and he asked me why I was working in the library, why I wasn't writing. And then he picked up the phone and he said, you know, you need an agent. And a friend of mine who was a writer there had told me the same thing. And he didn't get the agent, but I can't believe I'm telling you this. I wasn't even thinking about any of this before. So you're giving me the opportunity to relive some of my fondest mememories in publishing in New York. Yeah, well, he was, so he is, I mean, he's, I'm not in touch with him now. We lost touch a long time ago, and I kind of dropped out, as you know, from what's happened to my life. But I remember being in his office, and he had a clock that he collected plastic handbags. He wrote a book about it, and he was into kitsch. And I was a little intimidated, and he had a clock that was a poster, not a poster. It was a toaster that had toast going up and down.
Oh, that was the clock.
That was the clock. I remember
pop up on the hour.
No, I think it was on the, I don't remember, but and I hope my memory serves me correctly. And anyhow, I remember seeing that out of my peripheral vision and thinking, how can I be intimidated with this in the room? I mean, it just was so charming and silly and wonderful. And then, and this is not, I wish I could say that the rest of my writing was as even, but it wasn't. Writing about shopping was easy for me because it's writing about things.
Yes.
And it's not about emotional depth, and it's not about feelings, and it's a limited subject to a point. I mean, there was a shoe store I wrote up that literally was so expensive that I think it was on Madison Avenue. It was called Susan Bennis, Warren Edwards. They didn't have prices on their shoes.
Of course not.
So if you had to ask, you can't afford it. Like, ugh, how disgusting, right? But anyhow, so he had someone else in mind. I haven't even thought about these names in years. Holly Brubeck, who wound up writing the fashion column. But he connected me with his agent, and the agent had me drop the work off at his place. And I dropped off, I had a little piece in Vanity Fair about my dog getting mail, and asked me about that piece because it had an afterlife that was funny. I'll tell you after. But anyhow, I dropped a bunch of things off. I had written a piece that cousin, who became a beloved cousin and still is, who was the editor at Scholastic, had commissioned me to write for a magazine called Family Computing. I covered a family that had just gotten their home computer. Imagine such a thing. Does that date me?
Don't say what year.
No. Well, this was in the 80s. I think that's
80s,
right. So at any rate, I handed this stuff to this agent. I left it with his doorman, and he called me. And I remember being in the library, and I took off my shoes, and I put my feet, I planted them firmly on the ground so I could feel them. And I could feel the sweat trickling down me. And he said, I read your work, and I was just waiting for the but, because that was my whole life. And he said, and it's excellent. And I remember thinking, my eyes were closed, and I remember thinking, there's no way that I can turn excellent into a negative. And that served me well later because, you know, my poetry, I mean, I don't know what it is now, but it certainly wasn't anywhere near excellent. I can't say it is now either. And much of my prose isn't at the par of writing about shopping. But, you know, it's still a yes. And those yeses are so important.
Yes.
So I left the New Yorker to write this column. I did both for a while. I had a column. It was supposed to be weekly, but I couldn't do it weekly at the New York Observer, which is kind of a hoity-toity newspaper. And then I finally left the magazine. And eventually we moved to Michigan. And my brother, you know, I'm the youngest of four and the only girl. My youngest brother had a heroin addiction, and it was a huge secret. And I remember flying to Michigan and talking to Mrs. Walden before I left about him, and she was very concerned. She was the only one at the magazine who knew. So she was extremely important to me. And then he got into recovery, and I moved back here and was with my husband, who had been in theater mostly in New York, and we lived downtown in Indian Village. And then I wrote some online columns for a women's magazine, and I wrote and edited the Detroit Institute of Arts magazine. They had a magazine. It was a 12-page insert in the back of, it might be too young to remember, Detroit Monthly.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, it was a kind of like New York magazine. And that was just a wonderful job. And that's how I came back here. And then years later, I interviewed with Inside Out. And by that time, I felt sort of pathetic because my writing was, you know, I wasn't getting published, and I was trying to reinvent myself, and I had run away from New York and from a lot of stuff. And I somehow thought being home would be easier, and I didn't realize some of the familial issues that I was facing and some of the other issues that have to do with living in the suburbs or living in the city, of which I did both. And that's kind of it in a nutshell. I mean, I did a bunch of other writing in the interim.
Right. Wow, that's really cool. So you kind of got into the literary lifestyle stuff too. But you mentioned a little bit about your brother, and we'll come back to some of that.
Yeah.
But you know, overall, you've had more than your share of family tragedy and personal loss.
Yeah.
And all of which has left, you know, lingering trauma, which why wouldn't it? Before we discuss your debut poetry collection, The Plague of the Tenderhearted, can you give us some backstory on some of the major life themes that weave through your body of work?
Yeah, this is actually part of a larger manuscript that's half-baked, and part of it, a main thread, is not in here. I mean, the woman who raised me next to my mother, who a dear friend said she was your mama, and she was. My friend Monica told me that she was our housekeeper, Tina, who was with our family for over 50 years. And we had a very profound and close connection. After she retired, I still visited her at least once, if not twice a week. And when she was in assisted living, I was there all the time. And when she was in independent living, I was there all the time. So that whole relationship is not in this book. But Tina was my fiercest advocate. And I'm still dealing with the grief from that, and from some of the underlying themes that had to do with how our lives overlapped and in ways they differed. But there was tremendous, tremendous love, fully reciprocated between us, and tremendous respect and admiration for her. So she is just a small part of this book, but she's a huge part of my life. So this book is really about my journey through grief, and literally going through grief rather than around it. And my mother, who had a horrific diagnosis, peritoneal mesothelioma. She was given under 6 months to live. And then Tom, my youngest brother, relapsed after being clean for 13 years. And he did not want to survive. He did not want to be around without my mother at the helm, because my dad was getting increasingly paranoid. and weird. And my dad's business had gone bankrupt when I was, I guess, in high school, which is another story. It was a big business. Anyhow, so my mother was diagnosed with this terminal cancer. She's given under 6 months to live. In actuality, she was given about 6 weeks to live. But one of the kindest things my dad ever did was not share that information with us until my mother had survived over a year. And so Tom relapses, my mom's dying, and then Tom dies by suicide. And he shoots himself in the head. And we have an open casket, which is against Jewish law, first of all. But somebody suggested, a relative by marriage suggested that we have the open casket because then people wouldn't know, and people assumed he overdosed. And my mother was just we all were in shock, because I thought he could overdose, but it never, ever dawned on me that he could kill himself. And I do a fair amount of suicide awareness and prevention work now. And that single event forever changed my life. And so I'm going to digress here from the book, because to me, this is far more important than the book. Every 11.8 minutes, somebody in this country died by suicide pre-COVID, and those numbers have only increased. So I wrote a piece. It's actually on my website. It's not one of the best pieces of my writing, but it hit the nail on the head, and it was written very quickly. It is called My Brother and Kate Spade, and it described Tom, and it described this open casket and suicide and the warnings that I didn't know about. And it got published in the Jewish News. And I teach at Lawrence Tech. I'm on staff at 2 colleges, that's one of them. And I told them, because I thought, oh my God, they're going to see this, they're going to hear about this piece, and I'm not going to be well thought of when they hear what's happened in my family. Instead, the irony is a student there had died by suicide that fall. Thank God it wasn't on campus, but still horrific. And so I tell my department head, and I did a 3-day training on suicide awareness and prevention. And then I was offered to tell 2 people that they could do that training for free through an organization that I'm on the board of now called The Single Soul, which is about suicide awareness and prevention. So I called the dean, a guy named Kevin Finn, and I told him, and he said, actually, they'd read the piece, and he said, we've had training, we don't need that, but we'd like you to speak to our students, and we can host a special event in the new dorms, and we'll supply snacks if you tell this story. I was like, use me. Right. And then I was talking to a beloved friend from high school whose mother died by suicide. And my dad now was, this is years later, this just happened a few years ago. My dad was dying at this point. He was losing his memory, and I was going back and forth to Florida to be with him. She said, Cindy, do you really think you're up for that right now? And I said, not really, but I could be helpful. She said, tell them you're going to wait, you're raw. So I thought, she's right. So I asked him if I could wait. He said, of course. But then I really prayed about it, and I really thought, how can I help these students? Well, I was teaching World Masterpiece 1 and 2. So I was teaching a class in World Masterpiece 2, and we were reading Mrs. Dalloway. And Septimus Smith is a character in Mrs. Dalloway who is in the First World War, and he sees his best friend blown to smithereens, Evans. And he suffers from PTSD, and he winds up jumping out of a window. And as you know, Virginia Woolf died by suicide. Right. And then we're required to read the Mouse books by Art Spiegelman. And years before, I had co-authored a book with the rabbi, Dan Syme, who actually founded A Single Soul. And I was responsible for the Holocaust and women's issues for this book. And I had read the Mouse books and just thought they were remarkable, because they are. So I knew that Art Spiegelman, who's the son of 2 survivors, who wrote these Pulitzer Prize winning graphic novels where the Pulitzer Prize committee created a new category because they're nonfiction and the characters are anthropomorphic. The Nazis are are cats and the Jews are mice. The Swiss are reindeer. This is before we knew about their involvement in the war. The Americans are dogs. So I knew about those books, and I knew that Art's mother had died by suicide. So, which he addresses in the Mouse books. So my students had no clue that I had lost a sibling to suicide. And I just, in class, impromptu, brought it up. A bunch of kids, every semester, kids come to me and tell me what's up with their lives, and I'm concerned. That's happened many times. And at OCC, I actually had to call, the security there are police, they're trained police. And I had to call the police about one student because he had a plan. And when someone's depressed, you're supposed to ask, are you suicidal? That's the first question. And then the second one, if they say yes, you say, do you have a plan? And he had a plan. So, and that was at night. That was maybe at 9:30 or 9:45 at night. It was after a class. So I called my beloved mentor, a woman named Marcia Furstenfeld, who's a therapist. And I told the student, I'm calling a beloved friend who's a mentor because I can't let you leave here. We need to figure this out. And I had to write a contract, and she helped me. And the police came, and we called a family member of this young man's, and you know, it was heady stuff. It was big stuff. And when I had co-authored that book with the rabbi, I had read Man's Search for Meaning. I always tell my friends, if you haven't read that book, just go to my website, look under prose, under 100 essential books for Jewish readers. If you don't read anything else, read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, because it profoundly changed my life. And that gave me permission to not only talk about my brother's death, but to use my worst years of my life to help, God willing, someone else. So that's the main thrust of what this book is about, is getting rid of the secrecy of addiction, the shame of depression. Of course, my brother was depressed, and to talk about it. And I also went through a very sudden divorce, which was devastating to me. He was my first love, and I thought we'd be together for the rest of our lives. So I had a lot of grief that was connected and intertwined, and it was a very dark couple years. And I was single parenting, and then I had to reinvent myself. I had to figure out how I'm going to bring in more income and stay in my house. And I wound up working 3 different teaching jobs, all part-time, while I was tutoring and editing and single parenting. Oh, and I inherited my brother's dog, a semi-feral wacko dog. So there was a lot going on.
Yes, you did.
Yeah, I just gave you a mouthful here, didn't I?
No, I mean, I think that's how life is. But I think I noticed just something as you were talking when you first said that you were a little bit concerned about your employer finding out, and then somehow thinking, oh my gosh, who is this person? But I think that in the process too of being able to share that stuff with your students, that maybe you didn't knowingly separate yourself from your brother's actions. And so, because really your brother's, that act has absolutely nothing to do with you. And so even though it's someone in your family, and you carry that, like, it's like, you know, it's like this shameful,
It's horrible.
Yes, it's, I can't imagine personally. We did just bury a friend of ours, her daughter took her own life, and just, you know, being in that room with people and talking about her life and all those other things, and hearing people say similar things to what you're saying. You know, when you said that comment, like, what will they think of me? And I thought, well, you're just by association, you know, it's what you do with it. And you also just said that, you know, you might have helped somebody, but I think there's a much bigger testimony in what you just shared also, because there are a lot of people who suffer these types of losses, and you just gave them kind of hope for how you navigate past that. You know,
well, you know, it's taken years and a lot of grief work, a lot of therapy and a lot of grief work. And I was in a group called Survivors of Suicide. I actually thanked the therapist who facilitated the group. She volunteered to do it. We never were charged. And I thanked her in my book, and she hadn't heard from me in years. And she's the daughter of Holocaust survivors. And, you know, we all carry different grief. And one of the things that was really profound for me about my brother's loss is that when someone has gotten to the point where they're so depressed, they literally lose touch with reality. And my brother was by far the best looking Frenkel. I mean, he was turn your head good looking, these high cheekbones, these gorgeous brown eyes, his little nose, the nose I wanted, you know. And no, really, I mean, just chiseled features. He was like about almost 6 feet, very cut. And I was jealous of his looks, and he was so charismatic and off the wall funny. And I was raised to be subservient, not to say anything that wasn't nice. And I remember when that little piece came out in Vanity Fair about my dog getting mail, how he got on a mailing list. It was a funny piece. But the editor at Vanity Fair said to me, "What do you think of the illustration?" The art editor and the editor who hired me. And I looked at it and I thought, the sketch of the dog is horrible, but I like the shoes. My heart sunk, but I couldn't say that. And I just gushed, "Oh, I just love it." And now today, I would hope I would pause and say, the shoes are charming. Enough said, right?
Exactly.
My brother would have said,
"The dog's horrible."
yeah, would have. And it's part of what I loved about him. And he was so funny. So when my mother was diagnosed, he came to stay with us. And I was beside myself with grief. And this is an idea of what my brother's humor was like. I mean, he had no filter. And he could get away with it because for the most part, because he was so charismatic. So I was telling my cousin this earlier this week, because when I think about his humor, it just brings me so much joy. And I'm still in touch with several of his friends who are in recovery, who are angry that he's not with them these days, you know, who've been sober over 30 years. So, which is wonderful, you know? So anyhow, so Tom comes to visit, and he's got this little black dog, Magnet. And the dog is a cross between a Corgi and a Chow. And he's semi-feral. I mean, he just keeps nipping my ankles. And I tell him, you know, we're going to go away, my husband, my daughter, and I, and he can stay in the house with the dog, but Magnet's not allowed on my bed. And I'm a dog lover, but not this dog is not allowed on bed. And we leave, and I come back, and I strip my sheets, and I pull back the cover, and there's a rawhide under the cover. And I remember saying aloud, "Oh, gross." And then after Tom's death, I inherited Magnet, and I couldn't sleep without the dog being on the bed. I mean, that just goes to show you how the full circle of that story. So anyhow, so Tom comes to visit, and I don't have a bathroom on my first floor. He's staying in the basement, and I'm in the shower, which is on the second floor. And in those days, I had an opaque curtain in front of the shower, and he knocks on the door, and he yells, "Sin." And I said, "Tom, I'm in the shower. What is it?" And he said, "Let me in. I got to take a leak." I mean, how can you not laugh? You know, I mean, I'm just filled with grief. And I said, "Tom, go to the basement. I'm in the shower." And he said, "Oh, come on, Sin. I'm really uncomfortable. I can't wait. Let me in. I promise I won't peek. Come on, Sin." And I'm laughing. I mean, you know, there's the shower curtain that's completely opaque. He can't see anyhow. And he's knocking. I mean, he's really knocking. And I say, "Fine, Tom, come in." And then all of a sudden I hear, "Ah, thanks, Sin." Now I'm literally laughing. And then there's a pause, and he says, "Sin?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "I have a question." I said, "What is it, Tom?" And he said, "Don't you wish we lived in Appalachia?" It was just, so now I'm absolutely in stitches in the shower. I mean, and you know, I think one of the secrets that I've learned, and I also learned it from my boyfriend who has not had an easy life, is laughter is the balm. It's the key. And if you lose your sense of humor, and I tell this to my students all the time, life is really hard. Yeah. And you're going to have two choices. You either go crazy or you laugh. And I always choose to laugh.
You're in good company.
Yeah, and I love Auden. And one of my all-time favorite quotes is by Auden. And the quote is, "Among those whom I like or admire, I can find no common denominator, but among those whom I love, I can. They all make me laugh."
Mm.
So I was talking to my boyfriend last night, and we were having a discussion, a disagreement. That's a mild way to say it, because we disagree on some heady stuff. And then out of the blue, he said, and I knew he meant it, "Oh, I got a new toilet bowl brush." He's always ordering stuff. And I'm like, okay. And then he said, "I could have saved $2 and gotten a demo, but I figured."
It's like this.
I said, "You just made that up, didn't you?" He said, "Yeah." And I said, "I'm going to write it down. That's really funny. I could have gotten a demo."
That's funny.
Yeah. So.
But so it's something interesting. I'm kind of jumping ahead of here a little bit, but you had mentioned to me in a previous conversation that your brother's suicide had left some emotional shrapnel. And this is this coined term that you came up with to kind of, if you could encapsulate it in one expression. And so what are some of those other emotional impacts that maybe you haven't already touched on, or did you pretty much touch on them?
No, I didn't. And it's a great question. And I know I just went all over the map, as I tend to do, because this book, I mean, you were asking what it addresses. And of course, the three main themes are my brother's suicide, a sudden divorce, my mother's demise. And then the overriding theme is finding my own voice as an older woman, and finding not only the just incredible joy of parenting, which is to me, hands down, the best part of life, and finding love later on. But the underlying theme, and that relates to my brother's death, is that I grew up in a family that was really shut down, and everything was about appearances. And at one point, they were very prominent, and they had to be above reproach. We couldn't have a heroin addict in the family. And of course, no family is above reproach. And they were kind people. They didn't do dishonest things. They weren't slimy in their business endeavors or anything. And then when my dad lost his business, and he had a huge business, it was a glove business that is now John King Books downtown. And my dad, as you know, my dad painted as an avocation. He should have been a painter. He shouldn't have been a businessman. But it was his idea to have that terry cloth glove, that image wrapped around the corner of the building, which is now the largest used bookstore in Michigan, that iconic building. And my dad was just heartbroken because he didn't want to go overseas and hire slave labor. And he didn't. And he lost a very big, thriving business that his father founded. So everything was shut down. We couldn't talk about things. If they weren't pleasant, you didn't discuss them in my family. And his father survived the pogroms. So that was my paternal grandfather. My maternal grandmother's family also lost people in the Holocaust. So there was a lot of intergenerational loss. And I always say that our parents' generation, so many of them stuck together, right? They didn't think about divorce, but they produced us. You know, the generation that half of us get divorced, right? And I'm a big believer in epigenetics and unhealed wounds. Yes. And Stephen Levine wrote a book, Unattended Sorrow. And when you don't address a death and you don't talk about it, it comes out sideways. So after my brother killed himself, my father forbid me to cry in front of my mother because he thought it would exacerbate her cancer. Can you imagine? And my mother was determined to talk about his death. She went to Survivors of Suicide, and the chaplain who headed that group in Florida told me after my mother died that my mother was determined to talk about it, and it was regardless of what my father thought. And being a man in our family was really hard because men weren't allowed to cry. That was typical of our culture and of many others. Being a man is really hard. And my father was a misogynist too. It was very, very sexist household. So the standards we weren't even on the same page, except it was assumed I would go to college, which is, you know, a huge, well, just my mother went to college, and yeah, it was important to them, and it was a tremendous privilege, because I have many friends who couldn't afford to go to college, or they went to college and, you know, either borrowed a tremendous amount of money or worked like crazy. I have 2 students now who sold plasma, and one of them, she sold plasma, her sister sold plasma, and her mother's, in order for them to go to Lawrence Tech.
I tried selling it. My veins are too small.
Well, oh yeah. So, and one of them is a single parent who works 2 jobs and lives with her parents and is selling plasma. I mean, just, which, you know, that's a whole other topic, our educational system. But
Yeah, it is.
yeah,
I won't even go talk about my extraordinary debt, but let's keep going
yeah,
about your family. So,
yeah,
so before your father lost his business, and that was when you were the latter part of your high school
yeah,
experience, your upbringing, it was one of financial stability and opportunity. And yet it lacked this emotional intimacy, which is something that you touch on throughout your book.
yeah.
Success in your childhood world was defined by wealth and the perfect external objects that this could afford, which I can imagine how further devastating that would be when your father had to close down his business. But
well, wait, let me clarify. He had to close down his business, but they still lived quite well.
well, I'm sure
They didn't, yeah, because of some stuff that's not worth getting into now. But yes, my mother was clipping coupons. It was bizarre. I mean, it was just really weird. They were members of a country club and she was clipping coupons. It was just very confusing. But I never felt comfortable in my upbringing because I saw disparity all around me, and I couldn't figure out where I fit in.
which is
I still can't figure out where I fit in. Pardon me?
I think we spend a lifetime figuring that out.
Yeah.
But what's interesting on top of what you just said there is that you have mentioned in previous conversations that success is more, it's more complex than wealth and having, you know, being surrounded by all these objects and, you know, having savings in the bank and, you know, the types of things that obviously kept your parents afloat and, you know, good assets and things that, so it wasn't like detrimental when he didn't have his business anymore. But you know, it's more, success is more than this financial accomplishment and, you know, having the perfect white picket fence, you know, upbringing.
Jenifer, yeah, actually the white picket fence, I'm not going to get into now, but it has a horrible history that most people don't know about. But actually, I think that is the worst lie we're taught.
Yes.
About what is success. And I'm not religious, but Judaism says something which I love. And I alluded to this in a piece I wrote that appeared overseas. You mentioned it, and it's on my website. And the question is, who is rich? And the answer is he who is happy with what he has, which I love. Yes. And it's, for me, people have to be able to have good health care, yes, and education and a roof over their head and food. And if you have enough money to go to a restaurant and to buy new clothes and to take a vacation, those are wonderful, wonderful things. And, you know, a friend of mine said his father used to tell him this, he didn't coin it, but with my boyfriend, he's a retired tool and die maker. And he often says to me, women like you would never date guys like me because he didn't earn a lot of money. And I'm thinking, it's really stupid. And his father used to say, whether you're rich or poor, it's nice to have money.
Yeah.
And that's it. But success, and when I was living in New York, I saw this all the time and I couldn't stand it. People would run into you on the street, and instead of saying, how are you? They would say, what are you working on these days? And I know that, you know, because I'm older, that this book, I hope it's well received. I don't know. I tried my best. I have no clue how it's going to land. But the book doesn't define me. My house doesn't define me.
Right.
Even my body doesn't define me, you know. And what I learned from Man's Search for Meaning is that if we can take the worst part of our lives and assign them meaning, yeah, that we can transform them and they can become useful. So I want to be, you know, gently used up by the time I leave this planet. I hope that one person will read this and say, oh my God, I'm never going to think about doing myself in. What was I thinking? The ripple effects, this woman's life, she's talking about an event that happened. My brother would have had his birthday 2 days ago. And, not one day goes by when I don't think of him. And I told my other brothers, they don't even have to read the book. I don't want them to relive the worst parts of their life. That's not my intent.
Right.
But use it, let me do something. And, believe me, I know this is not at all on the same level, but Mamie Till said after Emmett's murder, let something good come of this.
Yeah.
I mean, if we can't take the worst things and choose to use them, then we don't have hope. And
Right.
I can't live in a world without hope.
Right. No,
So,
that's true.
Diane DeSillis, she's a
Yeah.
dear friend of mine. I just
People.
posted, she's so beloved in the community and enormously talented. I just posted on Facebook the friendship between Michelle Obama and George Bush, which she had sent me an article about. And, to me, we need to be coming together and we need to be hopeful.
Right.
And right now, in my adult life, I've never seen this country so divided. And my dear friend Don Major, I'm going to paraphrase him, but he says, these aren't his words, this is the gist, courtesy is the most undervalued spiritual action. And I just love that.
Yeah. It's courtesy is a complex concept.
Yeah. I mean, I was at the eye doctor a couple weeks ago, and you can't get into the waiting room unless you've been screened and you have your mask on and they've taken your temperature. And there are a lot of people in there, and I'm standing there and I'm really nervous because I am at moderate risk and I don't go very many places. And there's a woman standing up with another woman in a wheelchair, and they both have their masks down below their mouths and their nose. And I just said, excuse me, can you please put your masks on? And the woman standing looked at me and just like barked, get a life. Now my gut response was, you gotta be kidding. And I wanted to say back, I want to keep mine. And I thought that's not gonna be useful. And then she said, I'm asthmatic, I can't breathe with a mask. And I thought to myself, well, you should have told them before you came in so that they could make that call or not have you in the waiting room at all, right? I mean,
Right.
And instead I said, which is like my highest self, this is not me normally, I wanted to go, I was really hurt by her response. Instead I said, I'm sorry, that must be so hard. And I'm really scared. That's why I wanted you to wear a mask. And she did not know what to say to me because I didn't meet her anger with equal anger.
Right. And that's, and again, it's like this whole issue is complex. The mask is making me very sick because I also all of a sudden have this very bad asthma.
Yes.
Allergies are bad. And when I teach, I have to wear it for about 5 hours straight, no break.
Yeah.
And I leave and I'm sick for a day. And I'm glad I'm not at multiple campuses. Like I come home that night and I mean, I am just drained, but it's not from the teaching. I feel miserable. And then he's like, oh my God, am I getting right? Is that you, Corona? And then like the next morning you're like, okay, good. No, that was just my allergies. And obviously I know at this point in the term, the pattern is always the same. When I come back from campus, I get home and of course my allergies are also triggered from some of the allergens in my house, that it's just all of it coming at me is just making me very sick. And I don't go very many places where I have to wear my mask for very long for that same reason, because I'm like, it's killing me.
I wish they'd let you teach on Zoom.
I do.
Because that's all I'm doing.
Yeah, I do.
But I mean everything.
Right. Yeah. So it's, whatever. I'm sure it will pass. So I'm, I kind of just keep my hope on the hope deferred part.
Yes. So important.
Yes. So I am trying to blend a couple of things together here. I'm copying and pasting and moving things around. So I
went all over the map. Sorry.
No, it's okay. I'm not upset about it or stressed out about it. So, but I was just thinking about classism and racism and, your exposure to it growing up in a wealthy home with a housekeeper who's helping raise you. And, you know, I'm kind of curious about how that informed your worldviews. And then how do you explore these in your writing? And I guess let's start there. And then I want to hear about a story that, but I'll come back to that. So let's start there. We'll just.
Okay. Well, yeah, we had a lot of people in our house. I mean, it was a suburban house. It wasn't like it was, you know, some intimidating home to walk into, full of my dad's paintings. It wasn't like a decorator perfect house. It was really a home. Tina used to say that too. It's really a home when you walk in. That's a complicated question. I can touch on some of it. I absorbed a lot through osmosis because I spent so much time with Tina, and that stuff I don't want to get into now because I'm working on that. But I also was given such confusing messages by both my parents about being female and what it meant. And for my father, it meant, and my mother, I would be clearing the table after dinner. I couldn't be engaged in whatever discussion was happening at the table that the guys were. I had a curfew, my brothers did not. All sorts of sexual stuff. It was really like very sort of Judeo-Christian, old-fashioned about what it meant to be a good girl. That was huge, huge. But the biggest thing was that I was supposed to be a supporting actor.
Oh, yeah.
And being the main actor in my own life was not supposed to be an option. So dinner was supposed to be on the table for my husband. I was supposed to work part-time. Well, my mother thought that. My dad thought I should work full-time and have dinner on the table that was home cooked. I mean, it was whatever. I mean, he never said yeah, he kind of did, actually. My father was very, very hard on me, and my mother was very critical too. So it was a very tough household. And they were also very loving. You know, people can only give you what they have.
Yeah.
And I pushed the limits. My mother wanted me to have straight hair and a little nose, which meant plastic surgery, and to marry a lawyer or a doctor and have a country club wedding. I wanted none of that. And so my existence, fighting for my own voice and figuring out who I was literally an internal battle. And when I say Tina was my fiercest advocate, she saw me, you know? Mm-hmm. I mean, when you have, there's a man, I really want to contact him some point. He's a psychiatrist out of Harvard named Richard Mollica. And he wrote a beautiful book. He founded a clinic working with victims of the Khmer Rouge. And the book is called Healing Invisible Wounds. And I would excerpt it. I used to teach at Wayne State, and I would excerpt it in that class because he talked about these victims who survived the Khmer Rouge. Once they told their stories, they began to heal. And the power of telling your story and being validated is massive. And one of the biggest lies of this, it's not even America, it's the world at large. One of the biggest lies is that if you have a certain house, you have a certain wardrobe, you drive a certain kind of car, you have a wife that looks a certain way, a husband that looks a certain way, kids who do X, Y, and Z, you're going to be okay. And no, you know, what makes you okay? Hopefully you serve other people. You have a life of meaning. You've got your food on the table, a roof over your head. You've got health care, you know, food. I mean, right now, what's going on in the disparities in wealth.
Yeah.
But who, you know, and I remember I taught two girls in Highland Park, and all the teachers there, and I'm still friends with these teachers. The two of them, I spoke to one last night. She just sent me this wonderful text that I'd like to put on Facebook. I can't figure out how to do it. But there were two girls there who were absolutely darling. I mean, they were just beautiful girls. And they were everyone's favorite. And I thought to myself, they're not going to be my favorite because they already have people who adore them. I need to find people who need me, you know? Of course, I fell in love with these girls. And both of them lived in real poverty, and their self-esteem was remarkable. They just knew they were intrinsically valuable. And that was wild to me.
Yeah,
One wanted to be a secretary, and they knew they were like awesome kids.
I love that.
I loved that too.
I think that's what Tina saw in you, though. I think she saw your spirit and that wild soul, and she cultivated that in you and nurtured that.
I don't know. I mean, she was so remarkable and so happy. I mean, at her funeral, I remember saying to my friend Monica, I met her at Tina's funeral. She was the daughter. Oh, you know what? I don't want to go there because I'm writing this. I don't want to.
Don't do it. Here, let me reel it back in. So
but she was a force. She was so. I mean, she had such a like Tom. The charisma was tangible.
I love it.
Tangible. Yeah.
I love it. So, and we all benefit from it because look at you.
I don't know. Thank you. But so we should talk about my wide net, because that's, and now you're becoming part of it, and I think that everyone needs to have several communities, and I have that, and I have a really incredible wide net. I have two friends from elementary school who they're throwing me a book party with another friend from high school, and I'm staring at their picture. So they're with me here.
I love it.
And Tina's here. I mean, I'm looking at people who love me. And one of them, Carol Hemaho, is from the store Hemahos, and they've rebirthed and they're online. They're a wonderful presence. And I would quote her when I was at Henry Ford Academy in Highland Park, when I was talking to when I was teaching third, fourth, fifth, sixth. I taught fourth through eighth grade. No, I taught third some too. And was it eighth or seventh? Now I'm forgetting. I think it went up to eighth grade. But anyhow, we both were published in the school like literary journal for elementary school. And Carol, and I told the kids this is what I wrote. And we were talking about the muse and how poems spring forth. And I said, my friend Carol Hemaho wrote, there once was a girl who loved Jell-O, made her feel nice and mellow. She shook it as she made, gained weight as she ate it, and now she doesn't have a fellow. They just love that. And I wrote, now we're talking, I think third grade, right? And I wrote, Jack Frost came a visitin' in early November. He struck the corn bin when he came in December. Logs for the fire, colder every day. Coins for the sire. Jack Frost has got his way. Where did that come from? How did I know about coins for the sire? The muse.
You've got a poet's soul. I mean,
I have no clue. But reading was my salvation. Animals and reading. Cats, dogs, and
reading. But you can teach people how to write and how to write well over the course of a lifetime. But there is some kind of internal mechanism for people who are very literary, who can write literary works. Poets, great fiction writers, great creative nonfiction writers. There's something in their soul that isn't in everyone. And so it's this insight, it's this other sense and way of connecting with the natural world and the supernatural world. And
I don't know. I don't know if that's true. I mean, for me, writing can be really painful. And I always tell my students the key word is rewriting. But there's a story that I love. And Jay McInerney, the novelist, I forgot about this, but he studied with oh my God, who's the fiction writer who was married to Tess Gallagher? Ray Carver.
I thought I was like the cathedral guy.
Yeah, and I saved the essay. I think it was in the New York Times Book Review about studying with Ray Carver, and Galway was like this. No matter what you wrote, he'd always find something good to say. And Ray Carver did that. And Jay McInerney was talking about like one of the worst poets or writers in that class turned out to be the most prolific and well-known later on. So I don't know how much is nature nurture. I have no clue. But one of my mentors is Molly Peacock, and she talks about persistence. And Molly. That's it. I mean, it's
a lot of work, though. I'm not saying
Jenifer, no normal person would get would take rejection the way I have. I mean, I found this little book is what, 30 some odd pages.
Mm-hmm.
I found rejection slips from 12 years ago. I mean, I just kept going.
Oh yeah.
And I'm so grateful those versions weren't published. I'd be embarrassed.
Right.
So I have no answers, and I have no clue how the work is really going to land and for whom. And
for sure, but
just do your best.
There's something there's just a sense that's in literary writers, so poets and prose writers, that I believe, not that it becomes easy, because one, every once in a while you get that little rock star piece where it just flows out. But I think that was also swimming already. That was already brewing in your mind.
Well, I'll tell you something else. And, I think of other people who I just have so much admiration for who have done this. Like Terry Blackhawk, she was teaching high school, right? And then she found it inside out. Molly wrote a book called The Paper Garden, which I reference in 15 lessons. And it's about Mary Delaney, who literally began her life's work at 72. And my lesson was, your life's work has no timetable. This is the first time in my life. My priority is me. It's not raising a child or taking care of my mother, giving literally meds to my brother's dog so he'd live longer, being with my dad, caregiving. I was the caregiver for when my significant other had heart surgery. I mean, this is my time. Right. I mean, unfortunately, it's so bizarre with COVID, but
it's crazy.
I need to tell you though, and I have wonderful friends in Manhattan, and still several from the New Yorker, but I have never met such a kind and generous writing community as the one in Michigan. I mean, with ML and John, what ML has done is, you have the privilege and pleasure of working with him. It's just unbelievable.
Yeah, no, it is.
Remarkable people here.
Yeah. And I wish, I'm sad to be so isolated from each other, but I'm also glad for the readings and, the online things that we're able to do. And I look forward to seeing people face to face again for sure. But something that just struck me too is I was just thinking about your bio and some of the things that you had just said. I was thinking about classism and racism, and I was like, what is it that I'm trying to figure out and connect, with this question? And so you've really had not just your literary lifestyle, but also your teaching opportunities have really had a very diverse engagement with lots of different students. And I think classism and racism probably plays into both of those. And I love this story that you have, because obviously as teachers, we bring topics that are important to our students, depending on the classroom. I know that you probably don't teach exactly the same way at the community college as you do in your Lawrence Tech classrooms. I teach at university and community college too, and they're two totally different places. And you have to tailor the class to meet the students' needs. But there are also some themes that we just struggle with. A poet wrestles with certain topics a lifetime. And so we bring those things into our classrooms too. And that was kind of a vibe I got when I was reading your work. I just kept coming back to like classism, and not so much like, racism, we throw that word out and you just think black and white, but like racism is a much bigger topic, just not the, trending topic right now. But I'm thinking about, how do you handle that in your classroom settings? And you told me a really great story about value. And I love this story. So if you could share that.
This is I'm just realizing we've gone well over an hour.
You've answered some of the questions too.
Yeah, I just talked so much, but this is a story that's in my 15 lessons, and I want to expand that into a book because I have so many more stories. But this was, I went ballistic appropriately. I mean, I didn't go off and scare anyone or anything when I say ballistic, but so the students present, and one of the students, this is in a World Masterpiece 2 class, and one of the students was doing a presentation on the painter Jean-Michel Basquiat. And the student was talking about Basquiat's art and how I think the student must have mentioned that the painter died of a heroin overdose at 26. And his art later on, after his death, he was African American, broke the barrier in the American art market at auction, and it sold for over $100 million, one painting. And I went nuts. And I said in the classroom, all right, let's discuss right now what value is. What has value?
Right.
That is a painting. You are intrinsically valuable. There's something wrong with this narrative that this man dies of an overdose at 26 and his painting sells for over 100 million. Something is really seriously wrong. And to me, this is the myth that feeds the lie that the more you have, the happier you are, or a certain kind of house, or and believe me, I am so grateful for being in a safe, relatively safe neighborhood, and having a roof over my head. That is, to not have food on the table, or not have access to good health coverage, or to not have a home. Those are fundamental things that I believe every human has a right to have.
Yeah.
But then something happens, and when we start worshiping, it's like the Hans Christian Andersen story about the Emperor's New Clothes.
It's
No
perfect.
painting is worth 100 million.
Right.
I don't care if it's Titian. This is a painting. If that can help a person, feed someone, get them out of poverty, help educate them to lift themselves up. I don't know. There's just.
That is a big disparity, because you think about how much you pay for art, and some art, is clearly merits of a higher price tag. That's not what I'm saying. I know that's not what you're saying either, but
No,
I think the larger thing is I love that you brought it back to the human being.
And by the way, I'm a writer and a teacher. I believe art saves lives.
Absolutely.
So, somebody said to me, oh, it must have been so cathartic for you to write this. And I tried to clarify, and she couldn't really hear me. And I said, no, I told you this was not cathartic. No, I write this because I'm a writer. That's what I do. Because if I need help, I write stuff that never gets in print. And I go to therapy, or I do something else. I have a support people. No, writing this was about telling a story that I was hoping would help someone. I mean, that's a very heady goal. Of course, it's wonderful to be asked to be in your podcast, and I'm humbled and honored that this is so far, at least, getting well received. But
wait until you read the comments of all of our little favorite people from our writing community. Like, that's the other gift that's going to keep giving. You're going to get to go back and read their comments. And I love you guys who are watching right now.
Well, these are the people. These are among my wide net. I mean, we just have the best.
Yes, agreed.
I think that the writing community should be the model, and Michelle Obama and George Bush for our moving forward.
Yeah, for sure. And something I tell students, I think we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, is where you just mentioned what art is and what it does. And I always tell my students that art is an artifact of the time. And so, where maybe journalists or, historians are, trying to recreate, like, this is what happened during these times. Well, art is people's reaction to it. And so, and depending on the lens from which we're looking at history, I had this conversation with my students recently. Like, they were like, well, a history book is just full of facts. And I was like, whoa. No, there's bias there too, because if the stories are all told from the conqueror's point of view,
that's exactly right.
We're getting a biased, and in some cases, a very warped view of what the history was.
So I just read, I'll tell you, 2 books that I think are wonderful. One is from the viewpoint of Briseis, and it is a novel it's called The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker. And it's the woman's perspective. And here it is. And then another book that's remarkable, which is she was a mentor. This is it. Yeah, look, this is how I read. I tell my students have an active and
Oh, that's active.
okay. That's called annotation. And this is The Choice, which is a wonderful book, which she was mentored by Victor Frankl. She's a Holocaust survivor. And she talks about we have choice in life. I just finished this one.
I want to read that one.
I want to say one other thing. My friend Kathleen taught me this, and she's allowed me to steal the line, and I have it in a poem that's in part of Olga's project and, you know, the Canadian project with Barry Brody in Windsor. And the line is tincture of time.
Yes.
And, you know, there were, I want to sort of, if we're winding down, I want to end on that, or close to, because there were times when I didn't know how I could survive all this.
Yeah.
And to have a family that was so shut down, and to be ordered by my dad not to cry in front of my mother, and, you know, to watch my mother whittle away, and this very elegant, dignified woman who couldn't own her power appropriately and never, she would have been a phenomenal businesswoman. And seeing through the lens of time. And remember, next month, it'll be 20 years since my brother died by suicide. That, you know, no, it's right. I told you when we spoke earlier, I have emotional shrapnel. Shrapnel,
right.
I didn't do Sylvia Teitelbaum. We didn't do how lousy my father was. My gosh, I'm so old, I forgot. I got my teeth in my diapers on, but I forgot. And ML Liebler, he's going to be so upset if he doesn't hear a little bit from Sylvia. But that's the other thing. So my mother, Sandy's mother, not my mother. My mother's long gone. I'm almost 106. Sandy's mother, she's got this terrible cancer, and Sandy makes up this woman, Sylvia Teitelbaum, one of her characters, and Skippy, Cindy's mother, just laughs so hard, she's crying, listening to Sylvia. And Marvy, Cindy's father, he leaves the room. He can't even smile. The man can't, he's mean. He's mean to his own daughter, he's mean. And that's heartbreaking, but I want you should know, and I told my kids this in Highland Park, you know, life is hard. We all have problems. We didn't have such a thing as a cell phone. We didn't have a computer. I don't even want to tell you where things went. When I told you somebody brought a toilet brush, we didn't have a toilet. We had people coming for us to kill us. And we didn't have nothing like electricity. So we're very blessed in this country. You have no clue until you know what it's like to live through history and be afraid somebody's going to kill you for no good reason, because they don't even know you. And if they knew you, then they'd have a chance to love you, or at least make fun of you in a loving way, right? So yeah, that's Sylvia Teitelbaum.
And it's like I'm so inappropriately laughing because the content is horrible. It's like I'm trying not to laugh, but you're doing such a good job.
Well, you know, that's the other key. To me, the key to sanity is being able to laugh at yourself, right?
Yeah. No, I laugh all the time. If I didn't
laugh,
I would lose my mind.
And as a Jew, we laugh. I mean, you know, there's that joke, they tried to kill us. We live, let's eat. So that's what we do. So yeah.
Absolutely. And so I mean, we have touched on so many things. I think like I think some of these other things will just take us in such a technical, boring.
We don't have time. And I want to thank you not only for asking me, but indulging me, because I have not relived those New York years. I totally forgot about them. Well, I didn't totally, obviously they were right away in my memory. I readily recalled them, but they were so wonderful. And I wish that I can't go back, but I wish I could have followed my own gut and trusted it, you know, because I always tell my students that. And maybe I should wind up with a really creepy story that's true that I tell my students.
Oh, yay.
Okay, so yeah. To trust,
happy Devil's Night.
Trust your instincts. Well, that's, you know, let's skip this creepy story because it's true, but
no, you don't have to.
Well, all right. So a woman I knew years ago had a friend who went out on a date with a guy. He was very good looking. He was very well dressed. He treated her very well. He took her for a nice meal. And afterwards she said, "How was your date?" And the woman recounted everything I just said. And she said, sounds great. You going to go out with him again? She said, no, I don't think so. And the woman I knew said, why not? And she said, I just didn't get a good feeling. He turned out to be Ted Bundy. Yeah. So, and when I was little, I wasn't allowed to try. I was always told not always, often, that I was wrong. You can't think this. You can't feel that. Well, you know what? Feelings aren't facts. You can think whatever you want. You don't have to act on it.
Right.
But we all have intuition, and a woman's intuition is probably our greatest asset. Oh, Sophia Loren would say, a man's imagination is a woman's greatest asset. I love that line. But I think our intuition is.
No, I totally agree that and of course it's heightened for a mom. And sometimes I will reach out to one of my daughters where something horrific is happening in their life and they haven't shared it with anybody. They haven't really put anything out, and I'll go, oh my God, what's going on? And they're like, did you look at my, well, you couldn't have looked at, like, what, did somebody tell you? And then they just start like, and I'm like, okay, so there's something going on. And then they'll say, well, how did you? And I'm like, you can call it a mom's intuition. You can call it God knocking on my door. I don't care what you call it, but there's a sense that you needed me to call you right now.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Just bringing it back to the most beautiful relationship that you say that exists in your life is being the mother of a daughter. And I agree. I mean, I think sometimes they make me crazy right now as young adults, but
what you juggle is unbelievable, Jenifer. A magazine, a podcast, teaching, several kids, a marriage, unbelievable.
But you know what's really nice about, so I have to find silver linings, which I know you do too, but I would say with COVID, the silver lining is that you don't have a lot of drive time because you just run to your computer and log on. And I live out in the country, and so it's always like a half hour to an hour or more for me to get to events and stuff. And so I'm like, look at all that time I have to not have to drive in the car somewhere. And the other nice thing is so I have to do a lot of stuff with my one of the colleges I work for. We do online stuff, and I come to meetings with my hair wet. I just got out of the shower, and I'm like, I would never do that. I would never drive to campus with my hair wet, but I show up and I'm like, here I am.
Absolutely.
So, there's some of that helps free it up. And then I just let things go. I think a lot of people have, or people are like, what hobby did you pick up during your downtime? And I'm like, shoot, downtime. Like, people have downtime. Like, I have more on my plate, and I'm just like,
I know.
I didn't get go.
That's not right.
It's like, but I have more peace about it than, if you saw me a year ago, I would just be like, oh my God. And now I'm like, yep, I'm behind on grading. Yep, and it's just like, whatever. I just keep now telling people, no, I don't like that deadline. How about this deadline instead?
Yes.
And it's, but, and talk about like, taking power back. It's like, I've just learned to say, I can't do that, but I can do this. I can really try to do that. So I think that's been my saving grace. And I do take on too much. And sometimes it does make me go out of my mind, but look what's happening. I mean, we get to do this kind of stuff. This, seriously, I love this kind of stuff. I've been wanting to do this particular series for a few years now. And I was working with an intern in the fall who was like, or in the winter term. And he was, because I'm trying to launch this new book in outreach, and I'm trying to clean up some of my projects too, because I can't serve all these masters. And so I'm like, okay, cleaning up these things so I can focus on my book launch and publishing it. And we were talking about the podcast, and then like how it could be like this segue to talk to artists and writers, but also to talk to people in the industry for the trauma support. And I just, like, the more we planned it, I was like, if I don't make this happen. And so I was working with Joanne all summer, and I wanted to start it in June. And it was just like, time was just like a Dolly painting, like where the clocks are like melting on the trees. I'm like, that's been time for me since COVID started. And so I was like, how about we try for August? And I was like, we got into September, and I was like, no, we're not postponing again. This will happen. And I'm so excited that it could happen. And I'm excited to be sitting here again. And I'm excited when we end this call, and the next time we talk, we're going to conspire about, how we're going to get a panel of writers together and talk about, whatever, being female writers and talking about tough topics or whatever we come up with, planning the next chats and stuff. And so, yeah, so these are the kind of things that were, yeah, they take time, but this is my heartbeat. You know, this is what makes my heart beat, are these things. Like the magazine is impossible sometimes for me to put together, but I'm like, that, I mean, look behind me on this wall, if you can see the wall. This is only some of the artists. I have artists that these are all artists I work with. I have their art all over my house. And you're talking about having the friend's picture on your desk, and I have those too, and mentors and stuff like that. But their art is all over my house.
I love the new issue with Olga's spread, and I have cards by the artist who's got. I have a card. She's got an umbrella with the alphabet raining down. It's the same artist you have.
Katrine.
Yeah, it's just amazing. Yes. Amazing.
She's amazing. Every time I'm like, sure, I can use your art. A lot of people internationally have found her through the magazine and commissioned her for like book covers and stuff. So she loves the exposure too, because it gives her, you know, it gets her out there more too. But I'm always like, really? Like, because she's a fabulous digital artist. And I work with fabulous artists of all different types, but so she's got a very big following. So
you're just doing wonderful stuff with that. I'm so pleased to be part of that magazine.
Thank you. And thank you for letting me publish some of your work and our discussion that led into Olga. And I was originally trying to just pair some of your stuff next to her postcard series. And then
we both were so excited to be side by side.
I was like, whatever happens, because I had to move stuff around. The stuff that I originally had next to your work, I had to move because now I'm making her a major feature.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's okay, because however I structure this, I'm the boss and their stuff will go side by side. And so I was like, what piece do I want to be next to Cindy's poetry? And I was like, this is the one. And there were a couple of times where I was like, oh, this would go really good. Oh, and I was like, nope, this has got to go here.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you guys for letting me have both of your, you know, beautiful works to put side by side. So
after this show, I want to talk to you about Maria's work. That should be in there.
Oh, yes. And that's the other thing too. You just reminded me of something. I would love people to start scouting and sending me messages. So if you're listening, if you have somebody who I should keep my eye out, especially for the art, but not just for that, we the literature as well. Like we're about to do a big call, but
and Maria Costantini's own work, but the books that she translated two books of Ada Negri, which are sensational translations. So I wish she were here to be able to promote her own work, but since she can't,
we'll do it for her.
Maybe we should end with my talking about a beloved friend and being able to promote her work, since she's no longer here in body.
So, okay, so here's an invitation from the magazine to you. If you feel so inclined over the next few months, maybe you would write some reviews on those. Is it 2 books or just 1?
2. Well, I'll talk to Franco and see what her husband.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because we do book reviews, and as long as the book was written by a woman or someone identifying as a woman, then
I don't want to promise just because I'm on overload right now. I want to.
I know. That's what I'm saying. We just count again in the magazine. Okay. Yeah. So, but you can take a look at how simple and short the book reviews are too. But yeah, I would love to include that. But I would also love to invite someone else to contribute work instead of me trying to write all these things. But yes, so thank you for being so generous.
It was my pleasure. I'm just very, very pleased that you asked me, and thank you again very, very much.
Oh, and thank you for sharing all that stuff. It's like we've talked so many times about some of these things, and I mean, the audience doesn't know what, you know, I thought you might say, but I love all the new stuff that I learned about you today. So, and
I was going to read poems. I never even did. I wound up reminiscing about my prior life.
Where's your, because I have the manuscript version. Where's your book? Hold it up. Shamelessly plug your book. There it is.
There's the book, and that's a portrait of me. You can't see that my dad did when I was a little girl.
I love it.
Mary Jo Firth Gillette, whom everybody in the Detroit community knows. It is a beloved figure, and I stole the title from her with her blessing. She didn't even remember saying it. Chris Ryan told me. I acknowledge them in the acknowledgements.
Thanks
love
for
it.
letting me feel it.
Who
So
knew
yeah,
such a title, boy. Whew.
so if you haven't, there's some of Cindy's poetry from this collection is in the, I think there are 5 poems in the latest issue of Pink Panther magazine.
Three.
And was it 3? Okay.
I can't remember.
And you've got to get the book. If you haven't gotten the book, you've got to get the book. It's a great work. And there were
Mission Line Press, the book.
yes. So
Yeah,
it's
3
on
poems.
her, it's on her website, cindyfrenkel.com, right?
Yes, Frenkel.
All right.
Thank you,
Okay,
Pam.
so all right, so we should sign off now.
Yeah.
And just let's be in touch maybe next week.
Sounds great.
I think I have some crazy weekend plans to go figure out right now.
Good
So,
luck.
right, thank you. All right, you take care.
You too. Thank you again. It's been a pleasure.